Thank you very much. My name is Ben Bays, as he said. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And this is my presentation. I attempted to translate it into Latin to sound more professorial, but I had to fudge it just to make it look cool. So just an explanation on the title there. Abduxit means abducted by, and camera is the plural of camera. And what I wanted to explore here is the idea of the apparatus of the camera and its application to, of course, virtual production, as it is a significant component of that, but also animation and other sort of forms of image making along the way. I am from Texas, if that's not already apparent. I grew up along a 956-kilometer stretch of the Chisholm Trail, which is now the I-35 corridor there. And I currently live in Austin and teach at the University of Texas at Austin. I am aware of a lot of the conventions and the mythology of Texas, and just to note, these were all drawn by Europeans as well. So maybe it's because I grew up in that sort of stasis that I do sort of love crime. Not all crime, but I do love to steal, and I haven't had an original thought in my whole life, so if there's something in here that sounds interesting, chances are I stole it, maybe from somebody in this very room here, and then here's a couple of sources you might want to look into. I tried to use AI and LLMs to do a little bit of research on this, but in fact came up just a little bit short, so we'll see how those evolve in the future. I teach at the University of Texas in the Department of Radio, Television, Film in the Moody College of Communication, which is a big mouthful there. This is my 17th year, and I'm also teaching at another smaller university down the road. Smaller meaning it only has 30,000 students, and the University of Texas has 65,000 students and 15,000 faculty and staff members, so quite a large operation there. Like this wonderful school here, we have a lot of equipment, millions of dollars worth of cameras and lenses and dollies, studios and facilities that are quite extraordinary and great fun for us to play around in, including one of the largest green screen stages between the coasts in the United States, so certainly sort of as part of a university. There's also a motion capture stage there and a small virtual production sort of stage near there. We received a grant some years ago to explore stereoscopy, and so we have made quite a lot of innovations in that, and popularity of that has fallen off just a little bit, but as an offshoot of that program, we also developed a lot of technology around 360 video and virtual reality, including, if you look to the lower right, in that particular slide is a camera that we invented and patented as well. And as an offshoot further of that, we've been involved in AR and extended reality and have a lot of initiatives in that area there. So it's a very fun and exciting time to be involved in the technology of image making. We have a motion capture volume as well, and all this is to say that these threads are all leading up and important components to the idea of virtual production, which we also practice in a couple places at the university here. Nothing like what we just saw, but at the academic level it is quite fun to play around with. So I think we have a better sense of virtual production after the previous lecture or speech, but what you should know is that it includes a lot of different components along the way, essentially sort of the 3D CGI-ification of a lot of parts of the production process, and it has upended the way that we talk about and organize a film school. We typically used to think about it in terms of story and fundraising, and then pre-production, and then the actual production, as we have here, where we have cameras and a stage and a person and all of the operations, very expensive, as we just saw. And then my area, when I was involved with film, was in post-production and visual effects. And then of course we have distribution. With virtual production, everything has sort of shifted around a little bit, and those things which used to come after production are now happening before, and after at the same time, and simultaneously at the same time. So we can no longer fix it in post, as they say. We have to fix it in pre or fix it along the way. But this is an exciting time to be involved in this. And what I wanted to talk about today was the camera. So this is a virtual camera, a very simple one. This is what it looks like in Maya, and you can see some of the parameters there. Of course, we use Unreal Engine for a lot of our virtual compositing, but the parameters are pretty similar there. They're trying to reproduce what an actual camera does, imperfectly, I think. And I have the benefit of having sort of come up in video games, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, and seeing what a much more sort of primitive virtual camera looks like versus the much more sophisticated ones that we have today. But the goal of a virtual camera is, of course, to reproduce what an actual physical, the apparatus of the camera does. So, but I think in an unsatisfactory way. So there are at least two points in any sort of virtual production when you might need to use both kinds of cameras, a physical one and a virtual one. One is something called live compositing or simulcam, and the other one is on-set virtual production. Live compositing, or the simulcam, was a term coined by James Cameron when he was working on Avatar, and so there are a couple of images from there. And essentially, what we just saw it happen here, where someone had a camera and they were able to composite a CG character into a scene. The other version is this on-set virtual production, which we typically know as virtual production, where we have a large rear projection behind us of LED panels, and it's really kind of changed the way that we approach visual effects. We no longer deal with a green screen and then compositing after the fact. We're all doing it in camera. It's an in-camera visual effect, or special effect, or visual effect, however you want to call it. However, I guess the point at which that I wanted to talk about today was, does this idea of a camera, physical, and then the real simulation of it, confine us within some space that is maybe kind of operating against sort of an independent sort of creativity? And so my own personal journey, my professional journey, such as it was, I think maybe sort of reflects that, and I have some resentment, I suppose, towards cameras, so I wanted to bring that up here today. I started off going to art school for 6.5 years, so I don't know what that says about me, for drawing. And I love to draw, and as soon as I got out of art school, or while I was there, I wanted to work in traditional animation, 2D animation. Those are some of my sketches. And so I got right in there and have done, I started in backgrounds and then visual effects or special effects, hand-drawn special effects, and then I did character and multi-plane and layout work, things like that. There wasn't a lot of money in animation, but I had a great time doing it. Now, animation is very special, sort of to me. I'm the head of the animation area in my department, and I just wanted to bring up something that I always think about in terms of animation, and that's that the technology of animation actually does predate the camera, specifically the motion picture camera. So you can see some examples of that, the thaumatrope, the flip book, which interestingly didn't really come about till 1868 when paper mills became more popular. And then we have things like the zoetrope, praxinoscope, and then there's some other scopes in there. These all work in sort of loops or are very short, but I think that there's a lot of evidence that people have been engaged in not just sequential art, but something that's like proto-animation for a long time. And of course, as technology has developed, animation has as well. The camera comes along a little bit later. And I think that this is sort of important. Here's some technology that led up to the camera that's sort of interesting, and I think that there is a gray area about who and when invented the camera. And as I understand, there are rumors that Edison may have had a man killed and those sorts of things, but I think we can say pretty safely that around 1890, the cinematic camera as we know it began to be used. So this is a quote from one of those sources that I listed up front. And this is something that I do sometimes think about, is that often animation is sort of subsumed as a subgenre of cinema and is sort of thought as sort of lesser than live action, and yet it does predate it. And I think that there's actually not a terrible argument, interesting argument, that live action is a subgenre of animation itself, if it is that animation is to create change over time. The first animators were not necessarily constrained by a camera, and I think that that's what attracted me to animation. We do not think about, in terms of 2D animation, we do not think about what the camera is going to do. We scan these things, or we work in a program like Procreate or Adobe Animate or TV Paint or something like that. We only think about the composition. So we're thinking about the page. We don't think about lenses or anything like that if we're not doing stop motion. It's a very sort of direct and very free way of working here. So Walt Disney also sort of originally, and this changes a little bit, sort of engaged in this kind of animation. And I did want to point out that his partner in this early animation was a character named Ub Iwerks, who was rumored to be able to draw 600 drawings per day and is largely uncredited, but he was the one who actually drew all of these cartoons. The golden age of animation in the United States starts after that, and here you can see some slides from the Warner Brothers and Looney Tunes. And obviously they're considering 3D space, but not necessarily in any sort of realistic way. They're having fun with it and being very playful, which I think is what attracted me to animation initially. There's a lot of different, the history of animation in the 20th century is often about sort of the means of production, the cost of production, and I think this had a sort of an influence on the development of it visually, and so animation moves, and sometimes farther and farther away from anything sort of representational or figurative, which is interesting to sort of look at here. There is one technique, though, that was invented very early on by the Fleischer brothers, and it's called rotoscope. And rotoscope is a technique that exists both in visual effects and in animation. And essentially what you do is you take a film or a video of somebody, and then you use it as a layer or project it behind, and then you draw or trace over the top of it. And you can see it in the early Superman cartoons, and that's Coco the Clown in the middle there. So. As I said, there's different uses of rotoscope, so we do use it in visual effects, and it's essentially the same sort of idea. You're tracing usually just the silhouette of something using some tool like Rotobrush in After Effects so that you can isolate it and change its color or remove it or add something on top of that. Same sort of idea, starting with an underlying video or image and then tracing over the top of that. So. Walt Disney, you initially had that sort of rubber hosey sort of Mickey Mouse look, but in order to sort of streamline, bring costs down in his studio model, began to employ the technique of rotoscope as early on as Snow White there in 1937. And here you see an example of an actress who is later turned into Alice from Alice in Wonderland. So the reason for this, and I can tell you from personal experience, is as an animator, it's very difficult to just sort of work cold on a blank sheet of paper. But if you do have reference video behind it, it makes it a lot easier for you to work, and it allows people with not a lot of training to also be good animators there. So I don't know if you are familiar with Sergei Eisenstein, who is a famous film theorist and made the Battleship Potemkin and a lot of very sort of influential films early on. He was a big fan of Walt Disney, of all people. However, he eulogized the direction that animation was moving under Disney, because he felt that, and you can see some of the quote here, he felt that when you rotoscope, when you mediate what is animated through the actions of the camera, right, you're giving something up. And he calls it the plasmatic quality, or plasmaticity, which is a fun word. And we also call that rubber hosing in animation. And I think sort of the sacrifice that you make when you do rotoscope, and I've done it professionally, is that you are giving up that sort of freedom, that expressive quality that you can have when you don't have the camera, when you're forced to sort of do that. It takes a lot more skill to animate in that manner, but you can see sort of the results there. I do feel like it's having a little bit of a resurgence if you look at films like Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and a lot of sort of CG films now. They're less and less, the puppets are less strict, there's a lot more sort of flexibility, but that's not easy to achieve. There's a lot of hoops, technical hoops that you have to jump through to get to that particular point. While we're on rotoscope, it does have sort of an interesting history, sort of culturally. Here's an early Chinese animation that's employed it here called Princess Iron Fan. So you can see on the left, that one's pretty clearly rotoscoped. In some cases, you could actually see the underlying eyes of the film before they traced over it. It was embraced as a technique in socialist realism in Russia. So there's a whole period and quite a few different examples of rotoscoping animation, rotoscoped animation that you can see there, a couple of examples. Ralph Bakshi used it as sort of underground animation technique in the 1970s and 80s in the United States, and so you can see a couple of examples of that there. Including, if you look at that lower right one, it actually looks less traced and more like there was sort of a Xerox process, a photocopy sort of filtering process to create animation. You can also see that there's video mixed in there. So I guess I would question if the lower right one is in fact animation at all. And then Don Bluth uses it in several of his movies there. You can see a clip from Anastasia, I believe, which much of it was animated in Austin. So there was a studio there called Heart of Texas that did a lot of work for Don Bluth. It is such a good cost-saving technique that Filmation did it for a lot of its television animation. I don't know if y'all are familiar with He-Man and things like that, where they would recycle clips all the time, so it looked pretty cheap. It's been used in rotoscoping. Rotoscoping has been used in video games as well. Famously, Jordan Mechner used it for Prince of Persia, so you can see an example there where he filmed his brother jumping over things and then traced over the top of it. And later, Jordan Mechner made a game called Last Express, which is a little harder to find, but in that case, they not only traced over the actors, but if you look closely at that strip on the right, you can see that the actors, their clothes actually had black piping added to them, so they almost drew the lines before they actually drew them, so they exaggerated their outfits by creating lines on the clothes themselves so that it would make it easier for them to rotoscope later. Bob Sabiston is a figure who I know personally because I worked on A Scanner Darkly as a rotoscope artist or animator, however you want to talk about it, for over a year. That was made in Austin. And so you can see some of the process of that. Now that used a software that he invented. He's a very smart guy. And so if you see on the lower right, there's a process where Winona Ryder, we would get the video and then it would sap the colors out if you wished. And then you would go in and you would trace. It has a lot of detail if you watch it. It also interpolates the line, which means you could draw, say, like a strand of hair on frame 1, and then advance to frame, say, 20, and then redraw that strand of hair, and it would slowly, the computer would slowly morph that hair from point A to point B. You would not have to draw it frame by frame by frame on every single frame. So in that case, you know, we have two things that are mediating the animation: the original camera that captures the underlying video layer, but also we have a software that's interpolating as well. So while it was a joy to work on, we were giving up a lot of, you know, sort of our influence, our authorship as animators of each shot. So one thing that's interesting, an anecdote, is that there were 50 rotoscope artists on that particular project, a mix of men and women. And there were several sort of male actors, and Winona Ryder was the main sort of lead actress in that. And the men animators had a very hard time rotoscoping, tracing over Winona Ryder, and not making it look mannish. Okay, like there was some masculinity in the strokes, I guess because we're just familiar with drawing our own face in the mirror or something like that. That the male sort of animators really struggled with. And so the Winona Ryder team was largely made up of female animators. They did not have the same problem with men, so they did not feminize men, which is interesting because I think that there is this unconscious mediation going on. Even if you're tracing, even if you're just trying to accurately recreate it and just sort of enhance certain things, you cannot help but embed something in every single stroke. So I guess the question is rotoscope animation? Is it the same kind of animation as that which does not use the particular, that does not use the camera, right? That you just sort of draw cold, that the early animators did. There is an argument ongoing about this, and I include just a little bit of information about this. So Richard Linklater produced The Waking Life. He also produced Scanner Darkly. So he's been a big fan of rotoscope animation, and it's an important part, I think, of the ecosystem of Austin. A lot of it does happen in Austin. So it's been championed by those people, but it is an interesting argument, and I guess the Academy of Motion Picture Sciences denied the entry of a rotoscope film. So this is a film that was filmed on video, but then every part of it was animated over. And I checked, they use a program called TV Paint. So TV Paint does not interpolate. It does not do any tweening. So the animators did, in fact, have to draw every single frame. So that question of, is the software mediating the animation, I think is less strong in this particular case. However, the Academy declined it for consideration, and I think this introduces a whole bunch of other problems, you know, is CGI animation, right? Because their feeling was that, you know, too much technology and not enough sort of actual person animating it, and yet they sort of award sort of CGI, Pixar films, things like that, the same award, which I would argue is also mediated by something else, the computer. So that brings us to CGI itself. Now, CGI, as you know, is a simulation, an imperfect one of reality. And if you've ever worked in these programs, you realize that everything is kind of a shortcut and a sort of a simplification of rays. And, you know, it's not actual light. It's just sort of mathematics and geometry that create this sort of realism here. And so in this case, we have a camera which is trying to be a real camera, but it doesn't do everything real cameras do, okay? So it doesn't have these Bayer masks, and it doesn't have the qualities of a physical lens, right? But it simulates them as well as it can. Now, my sort of experience with CGI largely comes from video games. I started as a concept artist in the video game industry, and then worked my way up through environment art, VFX, and generally towards a lead artist before I became a professor. And the first game that I worked on was called Vex, and this is a 3D platformer, and in this case we had a little camera that follows you, right? And so I know that if you've played any video games, you're familiar with this idea. And that you do have some authorship over this camera. You could swing it around, right? And I don't know if you've ever been playing a game and you sort of come over a hill and you act as if you're the cinematographer. You're not simply using it as a mechanics for gameplay, but you're actually trying to sort of reveal it in a dramatic way. Maybe that's just me. I like to do that. So you're embedding meaning in that camera, whether you know it or not. And there's a wonderful book on video games by Soraya Murray, and it has a case study of, which one is it? It is The Phantom Pain, Metal Gear Solid, The Phantom Pain. And if you don't know, Hideo Kojima is a big fan of American cinema. And that game has a virtual camera. And this virtual camera gets dust on the lens, right? It does a lot of things that a real camera would do if you dragged it on this adventure, including the wind blows over the microphone and sort of peeks out and stuff like that. None of that has to happen, right? All of that was engineered from scratch to sort of simulate what a real camera does. And all of that was embedding meaning in it, okay? So the developer or you playing the game, whatever you're doing with the camera, whatever they're doing with the camera, you are consciously or unconsciously embedding meaning in that camera. So I struggled with the camera in games that tried to reproduce comics because, of course, they're not bound to the physics of a camera. Sometimes I had to do isometric or axonometric renderings, which, of course, do what a real camera cannot do. In some cases, there's Incredible Hulk. We were rendering with two cameras at the same time, an isometric and a perspective camera in the foreground and the background. It was only very late in my sort of professional career that I came into visual effects, and that sort of sideways. I worked on a project that was more like a live broadcast that did live compositing, where I was the in-world composite director for something called Video Ranch. And so we were filming people on a stage, projecting them into a CGI world, something like Second Life, but even clunkier, if you can imagine, and then taking virtual cameras and projecting those back into the real world. So the real and the virtual coming together. So I showed this slide earlier, and we have a real camera that, and as a visual effects person, you have to match that. You get the plate, right? You may have some influence on it, but largely you're just inheriting what the production has done. But in virtual production, of course, we start with CG and simulated cameras, and then we move to real cameras, and then back to CG cameras as well. And my sense is that in all of this, we may be confining ourselves further and further. The results are undeniably spectacular. And a sense of realism and photorealism of these things coming together is the goal, but all of it is confined in the digital, which is another conversation altogether. So all this is to say, and I know I don't have answers because I have only complicated it further by sort of researching it or thinking about these things myself, but what is animation? Is a clock animated, right? It is moving, it is changing over time, and what role does technology play? Is live action a type of animation? Animation a special effect? Is it a genre or a medium or both? And to what extent does a camera, real or simulated, mediate the image that we are making? So I think I'm about out of time, but thank you so much, and I appreciate your attention. So thank you.